Hello? Who?
Yeah, there you go. Don't be shy.
Yeah. I'm better just booming my voice than using a mic. Good evening, everyone. Normally I don't need a mic because I have a big mouth, but I'll use it tonight. We've got a great crowd. I just wanted to introduce myself for those that weren't here last week. My name is Ann Kowal, and I am the new event coordinator for UMR Connects. So I'm thrilled for this opportunity. A lot of you know what this program is all about. If you have any ideas and you'd like to run them past me, please feel free to pick up one of my business cards in the back. Any input you'd like to give me, I welcome. So just drop me an email. And if anyone is interested in giving more input than that, I am putting together an advisory committee. Your time commitment would be very minimal. We'll meet about 4 times a year. And just really to help think of themes and the topics to go under those themes. So if anybody is interested in that, please talk to me afterward. I'd love to meet you and get some information from you. Sam, you all ready?
Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Samantha Ream, and thank you all for coming tonight as we continue our May theme on conspiracy and critical connection. Just a reminder, and for those who don't know, UMR Connects is at 7 p.m. every Tuesday night. It's free and open to the public. Next week, we will have Dean Erdahl, a Minnesota State representative, presenting on who really killed President Lincoln. And if you haven't already done so, please sign in to get your name into our door prize drawing. The information is only used to let you know of upcoming events, and the winner will receive a $20 gift card to the MGear store at the end of the night. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Oh, this last Saturday, I graduated from UMR. Thank you. And now for our speaker. Make my face turn more red. Geoff Maas is the MetroGIS Program Coordinator in the Metropolitan Council in St. Paul. He has his master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, where he is also an adjunct professor of Geographic Information Systems and a Bachelor of Arts degree in geography from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. He has 20 years of professional experience working in the fields of urban planning, cartography, GIS, and urban history. He lives in Northeast Minneapolis with his wife Kate and the 2 very spoiled cats, Rocky and Jean-Claude. Please join me in welcoming Geoff Maas.
Everyone hear me? Before I get started, I want to thank Samantha for the very generous introduction. I want to thank Ann for her excellent organizational work putting this together. Thank my IT person, Brandon, for making sure all of the whiz-bangery works. Brandon also just graduated. If we can give a round of applause to him. And also to UMR for the very handsome invitation to come down and speak with you this evening. So, make sure my buttons are working here. As Samantha mentioned, my name is Geoff Maas. I work at the Metropolitan Council in St. Paul. The Metropolitan Council, for those who may not be aware of it, is a regional government created by the legislature that handles buses, sewer, wastewater, transit, those kinds of things in the 7 metropolitan counties. As you can imagine, all of those activities create a great deal of data, and I work with making sure the data flows between cities and counties and school districts and watershed districts so it's standardized and available. So I do a lot of data policy stuff, which it's not very sexy, but someone needs to do it. So as she mentioned, I also teach a night class at the University of Minnesota at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, where I have my master's degree in urban planning in Geographic Information Systems. So let's get started. So what I'm going to cover tonight, I'll probably go about a half hour because I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions. And I'm kind of middle-aged and lumpy, so there's lots of shiny things. Listen to me, look at this stuff. Don't look at me. So what I'm going to cover is sort of the concept of environmental justice very quickly. I'm going to talk about the influence of historical processes in city forming. Mention a few things about housing policy and transportation infrastructure investment. We'll be looking obviously at Minneapolis-St. Paul. It's where I've lived for the past 10 years. We'll be looking at these issues through the lens of urban planning, city planning. You could look at these issues through public health, or through economics or a variety of different disciplines. I'm going through at them through urban planning, and I'm going to emphasize the spatial relationship. So I have a lot of maps. That's kind of my stock in trade, is how to make things visual and spatial. So what is environmental justice? Environmental justice, it has its origins in the social change and civil rights movements of the 1960s. There are two parallel uses of the term. A social movement working toward the fair disbursement of environmental benefits and burdens, and it's also an interdisciplinary body of study including law, environmental science, public policy, planning, sustainability, and political ecology. For many years in the United States, it was put the landfill where the poor people live, run the highway through where the minorities live, those kinds of things. They weren't afforded the same protections as majority populations, and a lot of this stuff grew out of let's study where we're going to put things and how we're going to do things. One of the major cases of environmental justice was actually in Warren County, North Carolina in the late 70s, early 80s. If you can see in red, it's Warren County's up near the Virginia border in North Carolina. There was a company illegally dumping PCBs along roadways, and they had to scrape up all the soil and take it somewhere. And they were going to dump it, basically create a 150-acre landfill site for 60,000 tons of this contaminated soil in Warren County, which was 70% African American, and also 20% of that county's population was at or below the poverty level. So a part of the state with very acute economic need, and also a large minority group population there. Obviously, we all know, we've all heard about PCBs. They're terrible for contaminating groundwater and causing human health problems. And there were a great deal of marches and protests over this. There was over 500 arrests with this particular issue. But that was really the first major way that environmental justice came onto the scene in the United States. There is a historical marker near there that commemorates it's sparking the environmental justice movement in the United States. If you're interested in where these kinds of things are happening around the world, there's actually a really good website, ejatlas.org, and it takes you to a variety of, you can zoom in and click on sites, and it'll tell you all about where these kinds of issues are taking place. There's one in the upper Midwest you can see there. It's actually the Crandon mine in north central Wisconsin is that orange dot there. That's the one closest to us that is active on their site at the moment. In my opening, I mentioned something called political ecology, which is a term people ask me a lot about. Political ecology is sort of a sub-discipline of politics, but it's very specific, and it's the study and the impact of policy, economy, and society on the landscape and the environment. So public policy creates landscape. The landscape will look a certain way because of what kind of policies are passed. And a really good example of this is the boundary between Austria and Slovakia in Europe. Anybody been to Austria, Eastern Europe? Okay, a number of folks here. So the Morava River in this section here forms the boundary between Eastern Austria and Western Slovakia. And you can see from this satellite image very clearly, look at how the farm fields, you can see very evidently here, same rainfall, same soils, same climate, same crops being grown. Largely potatoes and forage crops through here. And Austria has been, since the end of World War II, a capitalist economy where people subdivide their land out amongst their children, and you can see that, whereas Slovakia was part of Czechoslovakia until 1992 and was under a command communist economy where they collectivized the farms. And you can see how different that landscape is from this very simple. So that's what political ecology is. And I'm going to be revealing a few examples like this from Minneapolis-St. Paul. One other thing to kind of keep in mind as I'm talking to you this evening is we spend, as taxpayers, and our government on our behalf spends a great deal of money on major public infrastructure projects. Highways, institutions, buildings, you name it. And one of the things I'm always interested in is how is this money being spent? And is this money being spent, is it targeted and only benefiting a few people, or is it benefiting the entire community as a whole? And the two examples I'll look at will be the development of the interstate network. I'm guessing there's probably some folks in the audience here tonight who remember before the interstates were built. George raised his hand here. He's enthusiastically showing his, yes, been there. And then also more recently in the metro, the light rail transit network. Anybody been to the cities and ridden the light rails at all? A couple folks here? Okay, very cool. And to keep in mind that, cities don't just spring up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. They are an evolution of cultural and economic processes that take place and change and morph over time. And the policies that are enacted by government wind up changing how that landscape looks. And so we're going to reveal some of that. This is a map of Minneapolis-St. Paul. So we have Minneapolis on this side over here, St. Paul over here. You can see the river going this way. And the dark areas, the areas in purple, are large concentrations of minority population. Minneapolis-St. Paul has the largest concentration of minority populations in the state of Minnesota, both in number and in density. North Minneapolis, so up over here, my arms aren't long enough. I should probably get my laser pointer going here. This area here, kind of disappears on me. Anybody want discount LASIK surgery? I can do. Note to self, make that funnier. Okay. But North Minneapolis is up in that area there, largely African American. The central part of Minneapolis here is largely Hispanic, with a significant East African populations of Somali, Eritrean immigrants there. Over in the west side of St. Paul over here, which is basically the central south part, is largely Hispanic. And then in this central part, African American, then you have a large Asian. Those are generalized. There's a lot of significant mix there. But that pattern, those concentrations are not by accident. If we layer this on there, and I hope you can see that from there, I've faded back those dark purple areas a little bit and laid on top of them the major highway and rail corridors. And then these areas in dark blue are the major industrial areas. Because as time went on and majority populations, wealthier populations, acquired the land near the river, the high ground, near the lakes, Lake Calhoun, Lake Harriet, and so on. The remaining less desirable lands, the lands near the disamenities of traffic, noise, dust, were left to, or industrial areas, were left to minority populations and also folks that, incoming immigrants as well. And so those areas have that historical pattern led them to be concentrated in certain areas like that. I want to talk a little bit, and the next few slides are a little wordy. I usually try to have more graphics up there, but I'll try to work through these pretty quickly. This is an actually very interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, and this took place throughout the United States. There were we all remember an era of discrimination in the United States. And actually, 1/4 of all private residential parcels in Minneapolis and St. Paul originally had what were called restrictive covenant language. And a covenant is a promise to engage in or refrain from a specified action. A restrictive covenant is a formal restriction or body of language creating a restriction or actions governed by covenants, which basically, these were things in the legal document that ran with that property, that deed. This is taken from an actual property record filed 1937 in Hennepin County. No lot shall ever be sold, conveyed, leased, or rented to any person other than of white or Caucasian race, nor shall any lot ever be used or occupied by persons other than one of the white or Caucasian race, except such as may be serving as a domestic for the owner or tenant of said lot, while said owner or tenant is residing thereon. Interesting. It's an additional one. So earlier, it's 1916, where they actually specifically list out the races you could not sell your property to. Shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any persons of the Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. Said restrictions, a little lawyerese here, but said restrictions and covenants shall run with the land, and any break of any either of these thereof shall work a forfeiture of title which may be reinforced by reentry. Reentry is the resuming or retaking possession of land for which the party lately had. So if you sold your property to someone of these, that the person who, they could come back and take it. Yes, there's a quick question here. I would have to look up where specifically Block 2 in the Seven Oaks edition is. I'm guessing that's in the city of Minneapolis. The Seven Oaks edition would be that subdivision there. Yeah. So. Yep. Yeah. There were a number, those are just two very specific examples of that. The Minneapolis Tribune, this is shortly after World War II, 1947, taken from an interview with the president of a large real estate company about a person of Japanese ancestry trying to purchase a home. Although he, president of the real estate company, sympathizes with members of the minority groups, most real estate companies follow the general policy of restricting subdivisions to members of the Caucasian race in order to get high mortgages and good resale value. So you have legal documents and business practices, in addition to, I just showed you the maps of the industrial and rail and road corridor things. So you have these varied ambient pressures creating where people are concentrated and located. But as I said, the legal policies, the business practices, and accepted cultural norms and behaviors creating physical separation, segregation, marginalization, and obviously limiting people's ability to get, leading to their economic stratification. So, yeah, I've got a question in the back there.
My parents bought their house in 1953, and South St. Paul had a research.
Mm-hmm.
There were no blacks in our high school. The whole town was white.
Yeah, yeah. So, sir.
Were there city and county laws backing that specifically allowing covenants like that or enforcing?
We're going to get to that in just a second. So, yeah, actually, there wasn't anything prohibiting them. So it's sort of, if you think of the other way, they weren't actually supporting them, but they were actually prohibiting them. Yeah. So we're going to get to that in just a second. Great question. So actually, the fair housing policy development, obviously as the changes in society and the recognition of equality of races and discriminatory practices harming society, you had, in 1948, the U.S. Supreme Court basically said that those restrictive covenants, that language, isn't something that's enforceable in court. So that was the beginning of it. In 1955, William Rumsford, who was the first African-American to serve in the California state legislature, introduced the Fair Housing Bill, which would outlaw housing discrimination on the basis of race. So this is several years before the civil rights movement of the mid-1960s. It took until 1963. He introduced it in 55 and kept fighting for it, until 1963 for the California legislature to pass the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which actually outlawed those restricted covenants in California, and the refusal to rent or sell property on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, marital status, or physical disability. Even if you think of gender, a single woman on her own had many barriers to being able to rent an apartment to buy property because of the societal norms at the time. However, 1964, the real estate and landlord lobby brought forth Proposition 14, which essentially undid the Rumsford Fair Housing Act and basically said neither state nor any subdivision or agency thereof shall deny, limit, or abridge, directly or indirectly, the right of any person who is willing or desires to sell, lease, or rent. So basically saying the state has no business telling you who you can and can't sell to. So if we want to have racist practices in our real estate transactions, we're allowed to do that. That's essentially what they were able to do. And this is the same slide, but I put this in here. You can see the gender language, as he, in his absolute discretion, so chooses, Or, well, why not include women? They're only, half the human race. So, Proposition 14, as I said, it gave realtors and landlords the right to deny housing based on ethnicity, religion, sex, marital status, physical handicap, or familial status. Obviously, I won't go deep into this. This is probably something that's very potent in many people's memory. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, that whole process, sweeping changes in how civil rights were taken on. It didn't address the housing issue directly. It made overtures to it, but it didn't address it directly. But in response to Proposition 14, the federal government actually cut off all housing program funding to California from the federal government. And then obviously that was one of the issues that helped kind of spark the Watts riots in 1965. And those of you who know American history will know that was a pretty significant event. 1966, the Supreme Court held that Proposition 14 violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. It's a very nice symmetry of the two 14s coming together. And then there was the landmark case, and this is kind of ends the wordy slides here. Apologies for all the legalese. But the Reitman versus Mulkey case basically said Proposition 14, the one that allowed people to discriminate, was invalid, and it violated the equal protection guarantee of the 14th Amendment. By the Second Civil Rights Act, 1968, Title 8 of that act outlawed the discriminatory practices. You couldn't discriminate on race, color, religion, or national origin for sale and rental. Yeah, that's just some additional terms with that. Just as a quick refresher, I mentioned the 14th Amendment. I know everybody here knows all of the amendments by heart, don't you? Folks are like scared he's going to ask me. Oh no, don't ask me. But the main constitutional amendment that the folks were referring to was 14, which is one of the Reconstruction amendments that came in after the Civil War, which basically said the state and federal citizenship was for all persons regardless of race. That's in our Constitution, dating all the way back to the 1860s. No person can be denied equal protection of the laws. So again, just to kind of wrap up the housing piece of this, long history of being contentious. It's a complex mix of issues. As I mentioned, the racial and social justice issues, the legal and political issues, the fiscal issues, lending practices, banking, and then the practices of the real estate industry. I've just shown you the very tip of the iceberg of some of these things to kind of whet your appetite for how it has shaped how the Twin Cities have come together. The next example, who here's driven on an interstate? I did coming down here. Okay, everybody, good. So we all know, I don't have to explain what an interstate is. Good, so I'm just kidding. Note to self, make that funnier too somehow. I want to look at the history of how the interstates developed in the Twin Cities. First of all, why do we have an interstate system? They were authorized to be created by the Federal Highway Act in 1956. They were to be a nationally planned system. They were to eliminate ad hoc road construction. If every city and county is not quite aligning stuff up and they don't have some sort of national network or national plan, they wanted to be able to put that together. Obvious the benefits of economic development. You had a lot more trucking going across the nation. Changing modes of transportation. You're looking at almost a decade after World War II. You got a lot of GIs coming back, buying their first house. The economy's good. People have more cars, and you got to have a place to take them and drive them. And then also there was a national defense piece with it too, to be able to move soldiers and material across the nation quickly. This is beginning to escalate into the Cold War years, so there was a lot of factors that led to the development of our interstate system. As of this year, there's around 47,000 miles of interstates in the United States. So I just took a quick shot of Google Maps of the interstate network around the Twin Cities. So you got Minneapolis here and St. Paul there. So 94 kind of comes in and goes up that way. You've got 494 on the bottom, 694 on the top, and 394 coming in. A little trivia for you. You may or may not know this, but this works anywhere in the U.S. Any interstate that's 3 digits that starts with an even number is a ring road. 494 goes underneath. 694 goes over. Any interstate with 3 digits that starts with an odd number is a through road. So 394 comes through. You can check this out anywhere in the U.S. It actually works. No charge for that little tidbit. You're welcome. So I'm zooming in here now to Minneapolis. So you have the downtown here. You have Nicollet Island. The University of Minnesota's over here. You have 94 coming in, going out and going this way. 394 going this way. And then 35W kind of angling up that way. That's what it looks like now. Let's take a look at what it looked like in the 1930s. I hope you can read that. This was a map that was made by a sociologist named Calvin Schmidt in the mid-1930s. And you can see he has you can see the old street grid, and he's circled areas. He went in street by street and kind of figured out who was where. And you can folks read some of that? If you can't, you don't feel locked to your chair, just come on up. But there's a lot of this like residential, lower middle class, rooming house district, apartment house, slum, Negro section, hobohemia. So he's got lots of terminology in there. Obviously things we wouldn't use today would be pejorative and offensive. But he basically divided out the areas by what he saw. And then also they looked at vice areas. So I'll read some of this. Rooming houses and apartment houses, flats, buffet apartments, and scattered settlement, old red light area, streetwalkers, shady hotels. He's calling out specific areas where these activities took place in Minneapolis. So what I did is I digitized all this stuff with our modern mapping stuff. And so you can, Negroes, slum, foreign-born, light industrial. The darker and the brown areas are the areas that we're seeing as, large minority concentrations. Guess where they put the freeways? Boom, right there. So this is 94 coming through. This is 395 coming down, cutting this way. This is 94 going up that way. That curve in 94 up there is not by accident coming down that way. This was obviously a time before there were protections, or there was not a chance for minority and disenfranchised and lower economic classes to be able to, be recognized and have their needs recognized and understood. And so they basically put these highways through the path of least resistance. Similarly, let's look at St. Paul. This is the river here. You have the Xcel Energy Center right there. You have 35E going up like this, and 94 going across this way. Similarly, Dr. Schmidt put together maps of St. Paul, difficult to read, but again, the same types of typologies of lower economic, immigrants. He's got things like, he's got this area here on the west side. It says slum, Jews, Mexicans, Negroes, light industrial, working men's homes, different categories like that. Again, I digitized his categories, laid them in, put them together, and I put the highways on top of that too. Very, very similar situation. I-94 coming through, wrapping around the top of the downtown and slicing right through the old Rondo neighborhood. Anyone familiar with the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul? Yeah, large African American. And why are those folks concentrated there? Well, we just explored that because of restrictive covenants, because of the other activities that sort of marginalize. This is the only places where these folks could rent or purchase a home. And then once they're there, we run a highway through them. Gold Coast is a unique, weird planning term that they use in the 20s and 30s for a wealthier area, usually higher ground. So obviously there's no coast, unless you count the Mississippi River as a coast. But that's a planning term they use for a wealthier part of town. Summit Avenue is actually right through here. Yep, right through there. So this is the higher ground here, yeah. Sorry, I don't mean to give you guys short shrift. I'm kind of on this side over here, but I try to go in the middle. Get a good workout going back and forth. So yes, anyway, as you can see, the sort of spatial pattern, when you can lay modern road networks on top of an older road system, or on top of an old data system like that. And actually, I also digitized the old Harriet Island. Actually, at one time used to be an island, but they've accreted the land and created the yacht club and stuff there too. So try to track those changes. I'm sorry that's so distant. There's a lot of detail on this map that take a look at. I also talk a little about, when I give this lecture, I usually highlight each of these areas and talk a little bit about how the changes are. The west side of the river over here, in what they call West St. Paul, it really should be called South St. Paul, but South St. Paul is down here, this used to be a nice gridded neighborhood. First generation immigrants would come and settle there. It also had a significant mix of Jews, Italians, African Americans, Mexicans that came through. And essentially when Highway 52 put that together, they just turned it into a giant industrial park. So a significant economic displacement of folks that were there as well. Actually, you can't see it on this map, but I went back and researched all the old street names too and put them on here. So there is, yes. Holman Field is right here. It was built in 1927. Yep. So again, living next to an airfield is another one of those disamenity pieces. I talk a little bit about some of those changes there. I also talk a little bit about privilege, because you see the yellower areas, the Gold Coast, as the gentleman pointed out, and also middle-class residential. Once you get up away from the river, the land gets higher ground, little wealthier, higher income areas. This area here, this is 35E, and it's very similar, very close to what is now the Summit Hill, Cathedral Hill area there. You know what the speed limit is here on 35E? 45. Do you know why? Because these folks are wealthy and have political influence and have said to their legislators and said, keep the speed limit lower. We don't want to have to deal with the noise and speed and things like that. So even today, that influence continues. So that was the historical example of the interstates. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the light rail transit, as some of you have indicated through your hands in the air that you have ridden. So that is the build-out plan, sort of this kind of that London Underground kind of map that they're using to talk about that. Title VI review. Title VI was part of that Civil Rights Act that I mentioned earlier. Prevents discrimination by government agencies that receive federal funds. If an agency is found in violation of Title VI, that agency can lose its federal funding. Large projects like light rail, which are going to be either, this is the Green Line connecting downtown St. Paul and downtown Minneapolis, just shy of $1 billion. That is a significant outlay of public funds. A mix of federal and state and local and other funds came together for that. So I also want to point out 2014 was the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act. So even now, we're still looking at these issues with rather sharp focus. So when the Hennepin and Ramsey County is where St. Paul is, Hennepin County is where Minneapolis is, when their regional rail authorities and the Metropolitan Council began planning for the Central Corridor, they began to assign where they want to put the stops. And they put together this map, and the areas in red are where there was a high minority population. And you can kind of see, I don't know if it's very evident for this map, it'll be better on maps I'll show you shortly, but there's no stop here, there's no stop here, and there's no stop here. These agencies were laboring under a federal policy called the Cost Effectiveness Index, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Well, as soon as those first plans were laid out, they were like, well, there was residents in those areas say, why aren't we getting a stop? How come we don't get a stop? How come there's a stop here and not here? Because folks know that transit stop, it's more than just a stop. It's more than just a place where you get on or get off a light rail train. Transit-oriented development, mixed-use development, lots of activities can take place near a stop that make it an economic engine. It increases the property values, changes how people travel, as I mentioned, the significant potential for economic development, and then the connectivity to the rest of the system. The challenge of any transit or bus system planner is how do we connect where people live to where people work? And you have to understand where is the residential concentrations and where are the employment concentrations. The Twin Cities has the 3 largest concentrations of jobs in the entire state: downtown Minneapolis, downtown St. Paul, and then the Mall of America / VA hospital / Best Buy airport area. Those are the 3 largest concentrations, jobs per acre in the entire state of Minnesota. We now have all 3 of those points connected with light rail. So as I said, in May of 2006, when they did an environmental impact statement, they have to, before you build a big project like this, you have to do all kinds of studies and reviews to make sure you understand the landscape you're going to be impacting. There were no stops planned for Hamlin Avenue, Western Avenue, and Victoria Street. By March of 2007, there was a growing public support for additional stations, and the Met Council, which is the agency that I now work for, actually I did all this work before I worked for them. I actually fought them for about 5 years, and now they said, God, if we just hire him, maybe he'll stop lobbing cannonballs into our side. But they agreed to study the inclusion of those stations. Okay, we'll take a look at this. We'll take a better look at this. So they're focused on that area, as I mentioned, where those missing stops were. You can kind of see them in red there, focused on between Fairview and Rice Street. And zooming in there, instead of just having a big block of red and saying, this is minority, we took a very detailed look at this, and if you can see this dot map, the blue dots are African Americans. That's 1 dot per person, using census data and running it through filters and mapping it out. The orange, yellow dots are Asian. The pink dots are Caucasian this way, and then there's some green dots in there that maybe you can't see as well that are Hispanic, and there's some other ethnic groups in there, and showed that, you know, significant minority communities, these are folks that maybe don't have a car or only have 1 car per household. They're very dependent on transit to get back and forth to their jobs. They're communities of economic need. They have lower median household and lower family incomes than many other places. They significantly are anchor communities for new immigrants, particularly from Southeast Asia. You have a lot of Hmong, Vietnamese, folks, the Karen group from Burma is coming now. And those people coming don't always have good English or any English at all. So being able to land somewhere with a family that can get them a job in their cousin's restaurant or some other family business along there is an important part of them being able to get their feet under them to be able to stabilize and get themselves set up in the United States. And then the housing conditions, much more rental and also a lot more vacant units there. So areas of significant need. How do we help them? Get them a transit stop. As I mentioned, this cost effectiveness index is this large federal algorithm, this big formula they use for funding projects and say, well, capital costs, operating costs, ridership levels, ride time, the sort of the mechanics of transit, or the only things they considered. And we made a very strong case to say, look, we can help ameliorate many of these other problems and support these communities and help out our fellow Minnesotans that are, you know, have not been as fortunate due to whatever circumstances they've had with, you know, with a transit stop and the various benefits that'll come with that. And so we looked at housing vacancy. This is one of many, many maps that we put together. Housing vacancy and economic conditions and you know, the condition of the housing, and put a lot of maps together with that. And so actually, due to the work that we did, they actually wound up changing the federal system and say, you know what, we're gonna, instead of just doing this for just Minneapolis, we're going to change the way we look at this stuff for all of the transit projects around Dallas, Portland, elsewhere in the United States too. So we're modifying that. Wider benefits to be realized by a transit amenity than just moving people on a timely schedule. There was a grassroots Stop for Us campaign. The proposed, as I said, LRT didn't include those 3 stops. We're able to get a lot of maps and analysis and things. And if you're an elected official, if you're a county commissioner, if you're a rail authority commissioner, and you have a dozen different groups all bringing you the same statistics and the same maps and working from this stuff, you're going to listen. You're going to like, okay, these folks have got a good case here, and so we help them make that case. A lot of community advocacy and lobbying that went on with that. These are some of the groups that were involved: nonprofit, grassroots groups, environmental justice groups, community organizing groups. I was actually the guy. I worked for the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy at the time. I was their map and data guy. So I was the guy that put the maps together for this stuff. And the reason we were successful is we were able to define a shared goal. What do we all want to accomplish? Add the stops to the line. Define what the shared needs are. We need the same information. We need good data. We need good maps. We need a consistent message. What is our strategy? We want to communicate this to the agencies and elected officials that can do something, and we define what does success looks like. Success looks like they're recognizing our message, they're hearing us, and they make some plans for the addition of those stops. This was the day they announced adding those 3 stops, January 25th, 2010. A lot of dignitaries here. Senator Keith Ellison, former Minneapolis Mayor R.T. Ryback, Ramsey County Commissioner Tony Carter, Senator Amy Klobuchar. Standing behind her is the late Representative Oberstar. That gentleman with the gray hair in the middle and the blue tie there with his hand down by his side was at the time the U.S. Department of Transportation Secretary, Ray LaHood, who came here for this announcement. The other gentleman behind him, right directly in front of the map, is Jim McDonough, Ramsey County Commissioner, City Councilman Melvin Carter, and also St. Paul Mayor Chris Coleman. But the main reason I put this up there is my map is behind them. So as the map maker, I mean, it's all these elected officials and dignitaries whose pay grade and importance is way above mine, but I got to make the map behind them. So that's why I like this picture. So anyway, so like I said, how was this possible? The political environment, the availability and access to all manner of data, which are, folks didn't have in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s the way we do now. The openness of the government process and the ability of the community to convince the government of its interest, which didn't exist in the 50s and 60s, and the changing societal expectations and the function and the role of government. What is government supposed to do? They work for us. We elect them. We should have some influence in what they do with our money to make sure it works for the entire community. Again, those 3 words: advocacy, action, and collaboration, kind of working together to make things happen. And you don't want it to be combative. What you want to do is you want to bring your case forward with good examples, good maps, good data, a good sound argument, and find ways to convince people that this is a good idea. And if you can do that in a respectful and interesting and engaging way, you're going to have a lot more success with it. As I said, sort of some of my takeaway. These lecture is sort of guided toward folks who are doing collaborative work, but I think this will resonate with folks. Again, defining a clear goal. What specifically do you want to accomplish? When I talk to my students and they want to do their final project, they're like, I want to map energy and savings and do all that, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, focus. No scope, no hope. You got to focus. You got to focus on what you want to achieve. Defining the share needs. What are the must-haves versus the nice-to-haves? We all want stuff. It's like, I want to renovate this house. Well, okay, how much lumber do we need to do to rebuild the deck? Start small. Start with manageable pieces. Getting good information, empirical data, legal and policy work, maps and documents. Anecdotal stuff about, you're building a highway, you're going to take my grandma's house. That's an important part of the story, but that's an anecdotal piece that adds, once you've got your legal and your analysis together, then the human story on top of that really adds weight to it. And the consistency of the message. Many groups using consistent materials and findings will give it weight, and the policymakers will listen. Capitalizing on the strength of the partners. Who does what well? If you're going to do a big advocacy project like this, you're going to need a researcher. You're going to want somebody who knows the lobbying world. You're going to need somebody who does graphics and geographic information systems can make your maps. Timing is critical. When's the state fair coming? Have a booth. Knowing how to use the other things that are going on and bringing your message to them at the right time. Finding a champion. If you can get a CFO or a CIO or an elected official who you can kind of tug on their coattails and say, pay attention to this, and have them carry the water for you, you'll have a lot more success. And again, the don't give up, water on the stone. I have Ovid's quote there: dripping water hollows out a stone, not through force, but through persistence. So again, respectful, intelligent, well-reasoned, well-argued, and you'll have success. With that, I will subject myself to your questions, comments, and scathing rebuttal. Thank you. Ma'am.
Regarding the covenants restricting Regarding the covenants that were on the books restricting home purchases to white Caucasians, was the Twin Cities the only cities that had those kind of covenants?
No, not at all. That was a common practice in housing throughout the United States. Actually, yeah, to have those kinds of things in there. Other questions? Yeah, sir.
Yeah, you know, I've gone to the Twin Cities many times. I used to take the bus when I was a teenager, and later I drove, and there have been changes. You know, like for example, I think one reason they have the highways going around the downtown because it's too expensive. I mean, the high-priced buildings and the real estate, maybe that could be part of the problem also. And I remember years ago, there was one Jewish, Jewish descendant lawyer. He couldn't get into any law firm in the Twin Cities, so he decided to start his own, and he was very successful. So he was one of the best lawyers in the city. So
There you go. You got to take it in your own hands if they won't let you in. So yeah.
there was other discrimination, like against like Asians and stuff. But now that's changing, and you have to have political pull, like you mentioned. You know, a lot of things they can hide. Like for a good example, Highway 63 north of here that goes to Lake City. There's one place when you go north of Gumbo Falls, it's a 4-lane highway. And my dad told me that some state senator lives in the farm there, and he made sure that it was 4 lanes.
Political influence, absolutely. So yeah, so you had a question.
So one of the things that's making the press these days in the Twin Cities, discrimination in the transportation of the busing. How does that happen today? Do you know the issue I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do know the issue you're talking about. Routing, transit planning, particularly with the buses. There's a number of issues that go with that. One was, where do you put light rail versus buses? Light rail is a fixed thing. That is an expensive thing to do. You're putting concrete and rail and iron in the ground and fiber optic lines and all kinds of IT that goes with that. Whereas that's going to be a permanent thing. And if you're a developer, you want certainty. You want to say, I know this line is going to be there that's going to raise the value of this land and my investments. Whereas buses, and even bus rapid transit, is more transient. You can move. Buses are much easier to move. And so there's a cost benefit to both of those things. That's one of the issues, is saying who gets the light rail and who gets buses, with the perception of one, oh, they're going to spend more money on this and less money on this. That's one of the issues. And I think just where they decide and how rapid they decide to run those things. I think in any area where they're not going to put light rail, developing circulator systems so people can get to light rail if they need to, yeah.
But it appears to be that there is some claims of discrimination in where the current transportation system buses run today, disproportional to the minorities than they are to the affluent people.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a number of studies that have been put together with it. I could probably spend all night up here going through that stuff. But yeah, that's a continually evident issue of even where they route bus systems today, who gets what buses and who gets express buses, who gets access and who does not. Yeah, excellent point. Other questions? Steve?
Naming the areas and so on.
Yeah, that comes back to the other issues that these gentlemen talked about, sort of gerrymandering, getting pork for a given senatorial or a district or for a representative district, and say, we really want to get this kind of thing. That's one of the reasons the state legislature created the Metropolitan Council, to say, so we wouldn't have those kinds of, we would treat it and actually serve the entire demographic body rather than just serving a specific senatorial or representative district that has a much, and you're constrained by a number of things in terms of you want to serve the maximum amount of people, but at the same time, if you're going to do a light rail, you've got to have engineering and right-of-way together, and we're largely using rail lines or old streetcar lines where those went through. So, yeah, good point.
There's a lot of, we're in early discussion about a connection between Rochester and St. Paul, Minneapolis, and some, I don't know what you call it, some kind of high-speed rail. Mm-hmm. A lot of controversy, even though we're in early stages. So my question is, given some of the discussions and things you've been part of, what kind of information do you think we need? What kind of questions should we be asking? Because we seem to have, many different conversations going on around that particular project.
With big projects like that, it starts with purpose and need. And who's it going to serve? How's it going to serve them? And what's it going to cost? So purpose and need. Is there a defined need to move people back and forth and that kind of transit amenity? Is looking at the existing commuting patterns, looking at, what is Rochester's capture area for employment here? And is it aligned along that corridor, or would people who live in that area drive to a stop somewhere intermediately and hop on that thing? They're having the same discussion with connecting the Twin Cities to Duluth as well. And so it starts with purpose and need and understanding, who's it going to serve and how well is it going to serve them. So those issues. When they do the environmental impact assessment, they look at why are we doing this? And is there a problem here we could actually adequately solve with this technology? So, unfortunately, I'm coming down to Rochester. I should know more about that issue. I know it very thinly because I haven't been studying it. But that's a great question. So, yeah. What else?
Not specifically in Rochester, but our rail infrastructure has really gone to hell since the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a cup at home that commemorates a trip from Denver to Minneapolis, or Chicago. I can't remember.
Mm-hmm.
But the average speed was 86 miles an hour average. And now the trains travel at 85 miles an hour maximum speed.
Yeah. Well, the gentleman, if you didn't hear it, he was talking about how the decline of the rail, and that's true of many of our infrastructural systems. There's actually a group in the Twin Cities called Minnesota 2050 that is trying to raise some awareness about we have all of this infrastructure, pipes and stormwater systems and everything else underground, and because it's underground, it's unseen, it's a massive investment that we've had in place. And new bridges, new highways, new amenities are sexy. Ribbon cuttings are very, people like to do that to show they're getting something done for their district. However, maintenance is not, and repair is not. And we need to make sure we're investing in that. And there's a social justice piece with that as well, to reinvest and to repair and replace our infrastructure system. That's a great point. Yeah, sir.
Do these same questions apply to other infrastructure like power lines and the grid and things like that?
Yeah, well, those are in Minnesota. Those are largely private. So you've got your XL Energies and your Great Waters Energy and various cooperatives and things like that. And they're under a sort of different legal system. They sort of operate as natural monopolies. So XL Energy has a service. I don't know who provides your electricity here in Rochester. I know. Local. Okay. So they're governed under a different thing, and they essentially have a natural monopoly, and they're governed by the Public Utilities Commission, and have a different sort of funding source. The revenue they raise through the fees go back to reinvest in that, and varying ages and conditions as well. Anybody here been through a blackout in the last 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? No, good, okay, I guess it's in decent shape wherever you're living. So I live in Northeast Minneapolis. We get one good one a summer. XL Energy conks out on us, and we're like, hey, so. Have you? Blackouts? There you go. So, sir, did you have a question?
Yeah. Parallel location of where they put the Transcontinental Railroad in the late 1900s through major cities. Does it compare to what you discovered with where the interstate highways?
Some of it, yeah, they will. They're parallel in some ways. The question, if you didn't hear that, was about the matching up of where they put the intercontinental railroads and where they put the interstate highways. Yeah, there's pretty close relation in many areas with that. Because
When they put those through major cities, they make poor and dilapidated areas to put tracks through major towns?
actually, in the slide that I showed, there was a proposal to use the east-west rail corridor that actually goes north of the residential areas of St. Paul. It's still intact there, and they said, no, let's not disturb all that. Let's go through the minority neighborhood instead. So that was actually a decision. I could unpack that further in a deeper presentation. But they actually had some discussions about should we follow the rail lines or should we go through here, and they actually went through the neighborhood instead. So, other questions, comments? Scathing rebuttal. No. Okay. Oh, you got a comment here. Yes, George.
I said, can you sit up there so this little lady can sit back?
There you
Even the restaurants, you know, I mean, the bus people, they have the white bathrooms and black and so on.
Yep.
That was terrible, but I mean, that's a sort of disgrace in our country's history.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things about the United States, I was just in Canada last week. I was up in Thunder Bay giving a presentation and about data sharing and the technology I work with to do this mapping stuff. And after the presentation, went out with my Canadian colleagues and got a beer. And the Canadians are, you know, it's sort of like living next to the giant. I mean, the United States is, you know, I'm very proud to be an American, proud to have born here and grown up here. But we have the sort of range, and we have the greatest good and wealth and influence and things. And we also have some of the greatest difficulties too as well. And so when you have a large pluralistic nation like ours, and the Canadians are always, they're asking me about how, you know, they have similar issues. They have a lot of theirs with First Nation, you know, indigenous tribes. They have a lot of immigrants coming in. Some of the things they're experiencing in Quebec actually is a lot of, you know, French-speaking countries around the world are now emigrating to Quebec, and they have a lot of folks coming from former French colonies in Africa, and they're emigrating to Quebec, and they're seeing all of these sort of issues that, you know, we've seen with immigrants coming in the past, and it's creating a very complicated situation with them. But they you know, asking us, well, how does this, you know, perceive? They're very interested in how we report their news, because we don't get the names of their political parties right. They have the Wild Rose Party, which is, I guess, a very right-wing party. I guess we call it the Wild Horse Party in our news, and they were very entertained by that. So I don't know where I was going with that, but just the thing is, in the United States, because we have we have, you know, 350 million people, and we have tremendous wealth and tremendous disparities. It's you know, it's tough to match all that up. So, any other questions at all? Steve, yes. Yeah, absolutely. A number of things make this easier. I talked about geographic information systems, which I won't get into in significant depth. But if you have a TomTom or a Magellan or a GPS unit in your car, or you go on Google Maps, there's a technology behind that where it's pulling from lots of sources. You can immediately get the name of the road or find an address. And if you get this data from a variety of county and city sources, you can do and census data and those kinds of things. You can do these kinds of detailed analysis. And I teach graduate students how to use this stuff, public policy students, public planning students, to work with this stuff. Very sophisticated software. You can work with satellite imagery and those kinds of things. And yes, and I'm a big advocate of getting that data out into as many hands as possible, so people can actually do their own analysis and take things to their city council, take things to their county, and say, hey, this is what I'm seeing. It isn't just a small priesthood of technologists that work with this stuff. There's, you know, to try and make it as available as possible. So that's a good question. And these things weren't possible, you know, even 20 years ago. This stuff is. I've been working with GIS for about 25 years. I'm just starting to get my hands around it finally. So yeah. Anything else? Sir.
There was a set of 3 lectures here during the last general election.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things which I thought was completely amazing is they were showing the counties of which various candidates covered. Amy Klobuchar covered every county in Minnesota except 2.
2, yeah.
Yeah. You know, when you get a politician like that, something's right for a change.
Yeah, yeah. So, anything else? If not, I'm going to have a sip of water. Thank you for your time and attention. Appreciate it. Get to pick the winner for the door. Oh, I'm going to dig deep. I'm going to dig deep. Mary Hung? She is, all right. Congratulations, yes.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
And thank